Well, I'll get us started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last session of day one of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Carleen Chambliss. I am the Collective Impact and Equity Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. And I believe I have another team members who will be joining and providing support if we need it on the back end. So this year's the CHAC is focused on thriving communities, and each session spotlights a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2023 across social media. This session is titled Making Permanent Supportive Housing Work in a Variety of Settings and for Different Population. And before I turn it over to our presenters, I want to take a minute to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Bank of America, JD Amelia and Associate, M&T Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. And our foundation sponsors, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Crown Wexnick, and Trinity Financial. These sponsors' deep support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. And last but not least, a big thank you to our future investors, Beacon Communities, and the community builders for your support of the CAHC. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and we will make all of the recordings available at the end as soon as possible. So please remain unmute unless a speaker asks you to come off unmute. And if you have any technology issues, please select the chat icon in the Zoom panel control and send it to myself, Carleen, and we'll do our best to assist you. Your speakers will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. And post the session, you can complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby. We truly appreciate your feedback. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily. Emily?
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. All right, hopefully you can all see that. We'll do quick introductions. We're excited to go through this with you all today. I'm Emily Bouton. I'm a Senior Development Director at Beacon Communities. We're a Boston-based affordable housing developer. And Ben, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, I'm Ben Phillips. I'm a Senior Vice President with Beacon Communities. And I happen to work on a lot of permanent supportive housing around the country.
Great. Colin, go ahead.
Yes, hi, I'm Cullen Ryan, the Executive Director of Community Housing of Maine. I'm from Portland, Maine.
Great. Okay, so today, as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about permanent supportive housing. We'll take you through kind of what it is, why it's important, the difference that it can make for people, how it can be challenging, and how the three of us have had personal experience figuring out ways to make it work. And we hope that you all can come away with some helpful ideas. And at the end, we'll open up for questions and an opportunity for you all to share your own experiences and ways that you've seen this be successful.
So I'll take this one. So permanent supportive housing is kind of an evolving, sort of an evolution, and the current sort of state of the art of serving particularly chronic homeless folks, people who maybe, tend to be more of the street homeless, people who are living with multiple diagnoses, maybe, very high percentage of mental health diagnoses as well as addiction diagnoses. And that's certainly not everyone who is homeless needs permanent supportive housing. In fact, there have been efforts to provide people with, homeless people with housing for a long time. The idea, the coinage of the term permanent supportive housing is really sort of mostly in the last couple of decades. And it really refers to, I sort of listed some bullet points here of some of the key features that are typical. And people often refer to the three legs of the stool of permanent supportive housing, which is, an affordable apartment. So a roof over your head, the physical component, some kind of an operating subsidy, because homeless folks typically can't afford to pay the rent, even an affordable rent on an affordable unit. And third, so like Section 8 or something like that, some kind of a rental subsidy. And third, wraparound services, very high intensity wraparound services. So that in fact, some folks who are homeless, a family who's run into hard times, paycheck interruption, loses their unit, is living out of their car, they don't need to move into permanent supportive housing where there's wraparound services, providing people with case management, counseling, direct access to medical care. That's typically, this is something we want to reserve for the most vulnerable people. And so really the two bullet points at the bottom, I think, are the key takeaway from what separates permanent supportive housing from other kinds of homeless solutions. It's that it's housing first. That's a low barrier to entry, that we don't require people to, well, first you got to get off drugs, and then you can move into the apartment. It's really hard to make major changes in your life and address long-standing, deep-seated health problems when you don't have a reliable place to call your own. So that's one, and then the other is that there's some kind of coordinated access, meaning that there is a prioritization by the local community of the households who need this particular type of intervention the most. Otherwise, we could build a whole bunch of it and put the people who don't need it the most in, and those folks are still, living on the street. So there's a reason that people who have not been able to get into housing aren't able to get into it, and we need to make every effort to make sure that if we're going to be successful in ending homelessness, you've got to prioritize, you've got to triage, just like people do in healthcare, with the folks who need it the most and are the most difficult to keep housed, and then provide them with all of the services necessary to stay housed.
Colin, you want to take us through this?
Yeah, sure. So I think that is anybody else experiencing a bit of an echo? There's some echo around, but we'll do our best here while we sort that out. Housing First, people have heard a lot about Housing First. It is a very successful model. The idea is that you move somebody right into housing. And I like to think of it that when you have people with serious and persistent mental illness, these are people with symptoms that are exacerbated by stress, and arguably the most stressful situation somebody can have is chronic homelessness. So when we see people who are homeless, they're often flurriedly psychotic. When you move that person right into housing and say you get to live here, we subtract that stress and we watch somebody clear of their symptoms just from that alone. So it has proven to be very successful. There are other components of Housing First, clearly. Harm reduction, having services on site that or available to people that are not required but are offered, that allows somebody to choose their own destiny. Those kinds of things are important, but people follow leases. But there are shortcomings with Housing First, although it's been a very successful model and it has about a 90% success rate in kind of all four forms. We see some people who just don't make it in, or who blow out of that as well. And so we've been looking at ultra low barrier models that don't require somebody to lease up, and essentially somebody can move right in. So we have one of these in Portland now. We're still trying to iron out some of the funding, but we have moved people in who have been homeless for decades, and we've tried every other possible housing placement to no avail. Now we've moved them in and we're seeing great successes. I will tell you that I first thought that we would see people come in from, living outdoors unsheltered for years, maybe spend a night in their apartment and blow back out again would see them in a couple of weeks or something. And instead, every person who's moved in has just consistently spent the night in their own apartment, seem to have done well. We saw somebody move into other forms of permanent housing. We've had other successes. We had one person who blew out completely, but it works really well. I'll tell you more about this later, but this model of meeting people where they're at, removing barriers and moving people right in is critical to the success of people with serious and persistent mental illness and substance use disorder. And I'll pass it over to you again, Emily. Thanks. Oh, there I am. I'm back. I'll actually go back to the other slide if I can. What happens is that when people are unsheltered, can you go back to the one slide before? So we found is that the population that is chronically homeless, people who are long-term stayers, tend to ricochet through our most expensive emergency systems when they're unhoused, and essentially stop doing so as soon as they're housed. And I'll just explain that a little more. For the last 2.5 years, we've been collecting data on a by name list effort that involves, we've housed 400 and let's see how many, 486 people so far with an 89% success rate. We still have 138 to go. And what we found is that within these by name list meetings on a monthly basis, we have people there from who represent jails. They can tell if somebody is staying with them that day, and people who are involved with hospitalizations can tell somebody's in the hospital. And so we've been able to do a comparative analysis of who's in jail, who's in the hospital. And here's what we've learned is that the population, the only difference is whether they're housed or not. The same population is up to 29 times, not to percent, times, 29 times more likely to be in the hospital when they're unhoused, and up to 57 times more likely to be in jail when they're unhoused than when they're housed. So again, the only difference is whether they're housed or not. And in fact, in 2022, last year, we had 4 months where not a single member of our housed list, and that was like some 400 people, were touching the jail or the hospital. And yet in our smaller list, which were 110 to 120 people who we not yet housed, we had 12, 13, 14 people who were touching the jail or the hospital. So the contrast is remarkable. Even with 4 times the number of people housed, not a single one was touching these systems. So when we house people, we stop that ricocheting. It saves a lot of money. I've been explaining this to legislators. That's helped them to make good decisions about investing in housing people because it stops this pattern. And now we just need to figure out creatively how to get everybody into housing and actually build a significant supply so we can make that happen. There, I'll turn it back over to you, Emily. Thanks.
This largely builds on what Colin just described. One of the key features I mentioned about permanent supportive housing is that it's evidence-based. There have been a number of studies localized of some double-blind, some not, regarding to evidence the reduction in use of these kinds of services that we were just talking about. Spending time in a locked mental health facility, spending time in a shelter, spending time in a hospital system. Every time someone's in the, those are indicators that something's wrong, obviously, for a person. And so a dramatic reduction over a couple of years after being housed in those encounters is an important marker for sort of, whether or not it's working. It's also indicative of a huge potential savings, right? These things cost money. And they take up valuable space, right? If someone's in a shelter bed, that's a bed that somebody else can't be in. If somebody's in an ER bed, that's a bed that someone else can't be in. It's dollars, Medicare and Medicaid dollars being spent because these are largely indigent folks. This is just one example. This Culhane report was done in New York, I think, more than a decade ago. Shows dramatic outcomes. There have also been reports that have attempted to quantify this. I will have quantified in terms of dollar amount, right? So like on average in a given community, perhaps, I know I've seen examples of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year in savings to various systems of emergency response resulting from a single person being taken, being housed, who was formerly unhoused. You gonna go ahead, Emily?
Sure, I can speak a little bit to this. So the purpose of this slide was to talk through some of the challenges of implementing permanent supportive housing, and I can touch on some, but I want to hear Colin and Ben talk about theirs as well. Obviously, this is, like all affordable housing, expensive, and you're relying on public agencies and other funding sources to get projects built. The operating costs can be particularly high because the residents who live in permanent supportive housing, like Colin and Ben were describing, really benefit from services on site, and that requires staff and space to do those services. So you need a lot of different funding sources, and often these funding sources all have different ideas of what permanent supportive housing means and should look like. So trying to bring it, make all of those requirements get met and also make the project financially viable, it has been challenging. I think people are getting really, really a lot more coordinated about it. And it's certainly, even in the last couple of years, seemed like things are improving in a great direction. But that's a tough part of it too, is just making sure that you're meeting all the requirements of the funding sources involved.
Yeah, affordable housing, I think people in this session probably have familiarity with how challenging it is to develop affordable housing generally, and some of the features of that with multiple sources and policies that tie to each of those sources and having to make sure that they all gel. It's just, it's that much more complex with permanent supportive housing, in large part because you have this whole other stream of revenue that needs to cover, you need some means of covering the expense of the very high touch wraparound service needs that these households need. And typically the social service funding stream, whether it's government or private, whether it's mental health or healthcare or outreach services, they're typically funded on much different timeframes than the financing for real estate development, right? You're generally underwriting, a 20, 30-year projection that this property will be effectively operated. And if a major leg of the stool of being able to effectively operate the property is tens of thousands of dollars per person per year in services funding, lenders and investors want to see that that's committed and that it's committed for the duration of the project, which is a mismatch. So there's a variety of workarounds to accomplish that. We're going to go over in a couple of examples of projects that we've worked on that address some of the different ways of making sure that those services are there, even though it's hard to get commitments for social services that extend beyond a few years.
Ben, you want to take this?
Yeah, so the first of these examples, this is 140 Clarendon here in Boston. This is a 210 unit apartment building today. Before we acquired it, it was only about 100 units. It also had a boutique hotel and some underutilized space, which we converted into additional apartments. So now it's 210 apartments, and half of them are set aside to serve formerly homeless folks through a housing first permanent supportive housing arrangement. We have a third party services provider because, well, Beacon Residential Management does provide resident services to both homeless and non-homeless households, beyond just beyond the stuff that's very specific to homelessness, like case management and mental health services, is also important, right? We need to build communities. Community is very important to people's recovery, and that community needs to include both the permanent supportive housing units as well as everybody else who's living in the building. But but we don't have, Beacon Communities doesn't have in-house mental health case managers, for instance. So we work with third-party providers to provide those services. Pine Street Inn is providing the services here. I think the thing I would point out about this project that's most sort of the biggest takeaway is that the small area FMRs from the project-based voucher program. I'm not sure if people are familiar with small area FMRs. So Section 8 can be allocated to specific developments through a project basing regime. The payment standard for Section 8 is market-based, which is helpful when especially when you're working in high income markets, although it's not helpful if it traditionally hasn't been all that great when people have, if it's market-based, but it's capped by FMR, right, by the fair market rent. And FMR is set on a metropolitan or county sort of level basis. And there are obviously neighborhoods where rents are much higher than the average. And so a lot of housing authorities have to, issue vouchers that can't be used. They issue tenant vouchers that can't be used because the tenants take those vouchers around and can't find anybody who will take, $500 for rent because they can get $850 in desirable neighborhoods. So the small area FMR is a HUD innovation recently to allow housing authorities to select a more refined small area FMR as opposed to just a metropolitan region-wide FMR, which sets different rent caps based on the local market. This development happens to be in a very high income, high rent area. And as a result, the small area FMRs that are applicable to this development are also therefore higher than your typical tax credit rents by quite a bit, and the revenue from those vouchers is actually paying for the wraparound services in this building. So while normally you'd have to sort of cobble together either third-party sources that are off the budget or philanthropy or build up some kind of a sinking fund reserve for out years after the or just make heroic assumptions about the continuation of these contracts and try to convince your lenders and investors that every 5 years or so there's going to be a re-up of the services funding. Instead, with this development, our underwriting projects that the services will be covered from the revenue from the rents, in as far as the eye can see. So that's 140 Clarendon.
All right, and I'm going to talk about Beacon House Square, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. We have not closed on it yet, but we hope to close in early 2024. And this project is kind of the opposite of what Ben just described. So, and I'll explain more about that. But what it is a joint venture between Beacon and an organization in Baltimore called Project Place, which has been around in the city of Baltimore since I think the 70s. So they have decades of proven experience of being a really effective provider. Their mission is to end homelessness in Baltimore, and they do that through a variety of different ways, whether it's administering voucher programs or operating transitional housing shelters or more permanent housing communities like this one. We've partnered with them to renovate an old school that they're currently working out of and operating a transitional housing shelter out of. Beacon is coming in to redevelop the whole building and also add 56 units of permanent supportive housing. And unlike 140 Clarendon, we are not putting any of the services for the permanent supportive housing residents in the operating budget. We have managed to convince our lenders and other funding partners, particularly we're going through the HUD 221 D4 program, and Project Place will be providing the services directly. And they, fortunately, like I said, have many years of experience showing that they are successful in getting these 1 to 2 year grants to support the provision of these services. And we've gotten people to buy into that and see that, get comfortable that they will be able to do that through the long haul. And we're excited about that. All of the residents of the permanent supportive housing will be supported by project-based vouchers from the Baltimore Housing Authority. So we're working with them on complicated tenant selection logistics, but they've been a good partner so far, and we'll see how that goes. But so far, we feel good about it. The next one I'm going to talk about is Parkside Village in Branford, Connecticut. And maybe some people on this call have touched this project at some point during its life. It's been going on for quite a long time. It's in construction right now. And this model is a little more of your typical, I guess you can say, affordable housing development. I'm not sure if anyone is typical, but the unit mix here, unlike Beacon House Square, the permanent supportive housing units are just a portion of the apartments at the building. So it's a 67 unit building. The unit mix and programs are really reflective of the points available in the Connecticut QAP. So this is a 9% tax credit deal and also received soft debt from the Department of Housing. So we were really trying to maximize the points that the project was eligible for. So we have about 90% of the units are affordable. A bunch of those are affordable to households below 60% AMI. And then we have a set aside on 20% of the units as permanent supportive housing. And we've partnered with Columbus House, which is an organization based in New Haven, to provide the services for the permanent supportive housing residents. And we also used our award of project-based vouchers from Elm City Communities to overlay on those permanent supportive housing units so that we have operating subsidy to support the operating costs and get revenue just to make the deal financially viable. And one of the challenges, which we touched on briefly around tenant selection, we ran into right before this project closed last year. So it was a bit of a scramble. But we had committed to CHFA that we would be providing this permanent supportive housing set aside, and they gave us points for it. And so it was obviously very important that we did that. And our plan all along was to work with the housing authority and just select residents that would both qualify for the permanent supportive housing. So they would come off the can and they would be on the New Haven project-based voucher waitlist. And as we were getting closer to closing, we realized we could not do that because Elm City Communities didn't have any preference at the time for households that were on the can. You had to go in order of the residents on their wait list, and that wouldn't necessarily meet, CHFA's requirements for this permanent supportive housing set aside. And so there was a little bit of a panic before the closing. We sort of got comfortable and said, we'll figure this out. And fortunately, a few months after, Elm City Communities did change their admin plan to adopt a preference for homeless households. And so we're starting the lease up in a few weeks, very soon. And we're still working through the nitty gritty logistics about how we'll pull from both the CAN and the PVV waitlist. But Elm City adopting that preference was huge and really, really helpful for projects like this to kind of meet the state's priorities for the permanent supportive housing set aside and also make the deals financially viable. Switch over to Colin's examples in Maine.
All right, thanks, Emily. So I talked earlier about some ultra low barrier models. I'm going to describe a couple. First is these two recovery residences that I don't know how it works in Connecticut. In Maine, we're encountering a situation where there's a complete disconnect for people who want to recover from substance use disorder, who are involved in homelessness, and people sort of in the mainstream with resources that can access these type of resources. And so what we would see is that if you're homeless, you might be able to get into a detox, and that would cover you for a few days, but then you're discharged back into homelessness, either outside or into a shelter. And the wait for some sort of a bed and a recovery program might be 6 or 8 months, and there's no way that anyone can follow through with a recovery while they're involved in homelessness, it would seem. So we set out to try to change that, and we came up with a couple ultra low barrier recovery residences that essentially move people right in. So we had a woman that was had long-term homelessness, I think had been homeless straight for 5 years, and decades of polysubstance use, and actively using, like on a Thursday afternoon, moved right into this housing by Thursday late in the day, and was supported with medication assisted treatment. And this is low barrier such that somebody does not need to have gone through treatment. They do not need 30 or 45 days of sobriety before moving in. They actually can move right in while under the influence, and with the use of medication assisted treatment, essentially go through a sort of detox and program, but they're surrounded by a supportive community. And that model has proven to be really successful for this population that tends to be in chronic homelessness. We've watched that particular woman not only was able to succeed in her recovery, but she also pulled her daughter in, who had been a long-term homeless as well. She moved into the same residence. Both of them have gone on to become essentially managers at other recovery residences, supporting other people in their recovery, because they got their feet solidly on the ground. A key to this is that we have to recognize that people who are moving right out of homelessness with long-term homelessness at that, they're not going to be able to pay for recovery residents. So we were able to get funds coming through a pilot program that essentially paid down the rents and the operational costs of these buildings so we could move people right in. It's proven successful. Now we're running into issues with that pilot having ended and looking for another source of funds to support this very population. But we've proven that this is successful. We served 98 people through this program so far. Very successful rates of recovery, but it really depends on what you mean by recovery. Some are using medication assisted treatment still, but they are certainly no longer returning to homelessness, no longer involved in human trafficking, no longer involved in all of these traumatic situations that were before, and remain in stability. One of the other components of this is that people are able to relapse. We assume that relapse is part of recovery, so we don't kick people out if they relapse. Instead, we say, okay, why don't we get you into a detox and have you come back in a few days and see if we can try this again? And we keep trying it again and trying it again, and investing in people and their success. That seems to be really important with this population because it tends to have a very low self-esteem and challenges in terms of their own visions of success. So when we engineer that success, people do well. The second is this place called Ashlea's Place, named after one who passed away. We all watched her. We knew she was not going to do well. She was 31. We basically got this building, has 8 units in it. It's not very big. We hired a house manager for it. And again, move people right in without leases. The idea is you could take somebody right from an encampment, walk them right into the building and say, you live here. No need to sign a lease or anything else. There are 2 rules. Can't smoke inside, and you can't have guests unless they're part of your support network. And it's not that we're going to kick people out if either happens, but we're going to zero in and see what else we can do to help make things work for people. This has proven incredibly successful. And we're funding it like a shelter. People are essentially, it's a per diem rate through general assistance. That still hasn't, we're way ahead of the curve in terms of the funding actually coming through. So we're supporting this through a grant right now. But it's proven to be successful enough that I think we could do others and see others be created by other organizations. This is really blown away the people who are involved in seeing people they never thought would be able to be successful in housing actually be successful in housing. So 20 different organizations decide who go in here. We just simply put asterisks on a by name list and say this person would be a candidate for Ashlea's Place. In the month before we opened this up, 3 people with asterisks died of overdoses in encampments. That's the level of seriousness of the population, and so we have seen a great success with this model, and I hope it's replicated widely across the country. I'll set with this slide.
All right.
And again, sources will vary. We're trying to get general assistance to come through to pay for this, just like you pay for a shelter. We're also working with community development block grants, opioid settlement funds. Those are just new to the state. We haven't gotten those through. And looking at Medicaid sources of funding, like a peer-based housing manager. Right now, we've just coupled together little bits of money that stretch out, mostly CDBG funds, And it is centered around a peer-based model. The housing manager was somebody also in long-term homelessness that moved right in from a homeless shelter. He's been great. He does outreach. He connects with other people. He sets the tone. It's really worked really well. And I think that's always key, just having somebody there who's really walked a mile in the shoes of the people who are there, can form those kind of connections and have it be legitimate. We also had a legislative effort that went through in Maine. I want to tell you briefly about. It's called LD2. It essentially was designed to support the services in Housing First. As you know, Housing First is kind of 4 different models. You have site-based models with 24/7 care. They tend to be larger units. You have blended models, some of which Ben and Emily described, where you've got a portion of a building that has supportive housing. The rest is open to low-income housing. You have small supportive housing, 4 to 6 units, sometimes 10 units, that's focused on a population, but looks like any other building on the street. And then you have a rental subsidy and outreach support, and that's the most common form of Housing First. All of those work equally, have about a 90% success rate. And what LD2 was we realized there's a gap in supportive services. So LD2, the way it came through after a lot of work, it sets a minimum of 20 hours of support per person per week. That's dramatic because in our other supportive housing, we're seeing something more similar to 1 hour of support a month. Inadequate, people are not successful there. This will be a game changer. I say will because the funding won't come until 2025, but it's to the real estate transfer tax. It will be ongoing and perpetual source. It also fixes issues with Medicaid so that we can pay for service provision. Our Section 13 case management, for example, in Maine, for some reason, ended after 90 days after somebody was homeless. Well, that doesn't make any sense. This is going to get fixed here. Another type of funding had all the components it needed and then set the rates too low for mental health providers to participate. So we need to fix that. So that's one of the fixes. And it also hires a bunch of housing stability workers. We're missing people who can connect with people while homeless, help them to get into housing, and then help them stay there. We're missing people who can do that and have funding for it. So this will carve out essentially $1 million a year to hire probably 10, 12 people who will deliver that service. We think they'll make a huge difference to encampments, to people outside, to people stuck in homelessness, and to their success, because a lot of our other support services models really run for a short period of time after somebody's house. So that will fix it. And any leftover funds will go into housing development. So that's LD2. It's really a pretty neat bill and should be a game changer and help us end chronic homelessness in Maine. But funding doesn't come for 2 more years.
All right. Thanks, Colin. So we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going to look at some of the stuff in the chat. I know my audio is breaking up. I'm sorry. Let's see. Okay, so Maria's question, is there any work being done as it pertains to assisting individuals with re-entry after being incarcerated?
One of those 2 ultra low barrier recovery residents I described that are recovery residents are taking people right out of their reentry from incarceration. We're pulling people right from the jails who were in there for substance use disorder reasons, and they are finding success in one of these low barrier recovery residents. So it's a funnel, it's a source of referrals, and we found great success with this population as well. Not surprisingly, because it's the same population. It's, again, they're just happen to be going ricocheting through the criminal justice system, and what we're doing is supporting them in housing, and they stop ricocheting.
I would add, well, this is sort of that question raises a whole additional sort of separate area of housing and policy work that I know people are doing that I'm not closely involved with around forensic populations, and people who aren't homeless or don't have chronic homeless challenges, but who are exiting incarceration, obviously need a place to live, and in some communities, it's with various restrictions, it's very hard for them to find it. So I would sort of think of that as sort of a separate challenge. However, I think it is important to note that among the low barriers to entry that are typical in in permanent supportive housing, there needs to you need to give real thought to that, right? It's there are certainly some things off the shelf, some best practices, but every property and every property owner, the mix of households that are going to be served in a property, the neighborhood in which it exists, is unique, and certainly when you're setting up a permanent supportive housing development, just like if folks again I think are familiar with affordable housing. Generally, these are apartments that are managed according to the state, federal, and local laws around rental property management, including fair housing laws, and that typically requires setting some kind of a universal screening criteria that's applied equally to every applicant, right? Like criminal background check, credit check, landlord references, eviction registry. Obviously, if you just picked up one of those that you're using in a given property that wasn't providing permanent supportive housing and intended to serve chronic homeless people and just used it, you would have a problem, because a lot of people would get screened out because they have had contact with the criminal justice system. They have been evicted. They have no credit. I mean, this is to be expected. And so you need to customize those screening tools specific to the population you're intending to serve. And typically it does involve some relaxing of the criminal background check, but also not a complete elimination of it, because there are, for instance, sometimes some of the subsidy sources that you're using to build this development will require certain legal requirements, right? Like HUD has, if you've ever been evicted from a HUD assisted property, you are not allowed to live in another HUD assisted property. Or if you've been convicted of methamphetamine manufacture in public housing, or any member of your household, then you're banned. These are like just built-in HUD policies that you've got to make sure you're also still complying with. And then, it's just the nature of the neighborhood in which you're operating, and what usually these developments get a lot of scrutiny. And so we've certainly, had neighbors ask questions about the backgrounds of the folks who are going to be moving in, and be involved in a conversation about, okay, what are the class of crimes that we can tolerate and the ones that we can't, in terms of violence or that sort of thing. So something that needs to be given a lot of thought.
All right. Any other questions or people's experiences on their own that they'd like to share?
If anybody's just got a question they want to ask, you could raise your hand. I think you can do that in the. I did see a comment in the chat about housing authorities, and I think it was just someone sort of indicating that they were happy to see that that this was joining up the housing authority waiting list as well. That's as Emily described, an area where, again, a lot of attention needs to be brought to bear. Some housing authorities have built into their administrative plan, which guides how they use project-based vouchers, some kind of a direct tie to their local continuum of care and its coordinated entry system. Every HUD recipient of participating jurisdiction funds needs to have a continuum of care, which is the planning group that decides, probably butchering some of the details here, but decides how that community is going to try to do its part to end homelessness. And that one of the best practices that most continuums of care are adopting is a coordinated entry list, which is a by name list of the people who they've identified through their annual homeless count and other outreach efforts are homeless in their community, and then prioritizing, through some kind of a vulnerability index or something, who on that list really needs the housing the most, has been homeless the longest, or has other chronic challenges, or has failed out of other attempts to provide them with housing, and puts them at the top of the list. And so, the continuum needs to try to get those folks housed, but that might not sync up directly with the housing, whatever your rental subsidy source is, or other funds that you may have gotten lent from public lenders who have policies. And so early and often you need to sort of revisit, okay, are we really, when we actually do the lease up, are we getting the people who the continuum says we're going to get? Will the voucher still be able to be attached to them? Some housing authorities simply allow the continuum of care to refer applicants to them, rather than using the housing authority's waiting list. So there's a variety of ways of skinning that cat.
Great. Thanks, Ben. All right, I'm gonna go. We got a question from Sarah Locke. She said, is there currently anyone looking to pair affordable housing advocates with service providers willing or able to provide the services needed? So Sarah, I think you can unmute yourself if you want anything more.
Yeah, I was either affordable housing developers or affordable housing advocates. Is there any one service or any one location looking to connect the service providers like Beacon with the housing developers so that they can coordinate their efforts?
There are a handful of intermediaries that work in this space. Community Solutions is one. The Corporation for Supportive Housing is another. Those are national organizations, and they often put together sort of programs. They're like encounter groups, speed dating, to try to connect people, developers, operators, and providers. And so I would think if you were looking to make that kind of a connection, reaching out to one of those groups would make sense. There are also some local organizations, like this session, that sort of reflect a movement to promote permanent supportive housing. So I think those are also good resources.
Thank you.
All right, we have two, I think, somewhat related questions, one from Dorothy, one from Allie, about hesitant communities and neighbors and how they might react to this type of housing coming into their neighborhood. Colin or Ben,
Yeah, I just took a stab at answering that, Allie. It's a great question. We had to really work with the neighbors ahead of time. In fact, this building had really been a hot spot. It had been used for youth that weren't really supported very well, and they became a kind of a flop house. A lot of people coming by and causing problems, and police there all the time. So the neighbors were really worried about what was going to happen with this building, because it's right on a corner, right next to a park, and had been a trouble area. It's funny, after we bought the building, we really tried to put up some signage and suggest this is not a place to hang out. And we kept the building empty for a number of months, I would say 7 or 8 months, where we're working on trying to figure out a strategy for funding. Well, during that time, we had neighborhood apartments. People were taking their trash and just kind of dumping it out right in front of the building, putting their garbage there. And so I had some neighbors reach out and said, why do you guys always have trash here? And so, I would say to them, well, the building is empty. It's actually not our trash, but we do pick it up every time. And they're like, oh, okay, but even them, they were ready to jump on us and pounce if the first issue. And so I had to explain, it's not even in operation yet. I hope you guys will give us the benefit of the doubt of having this work. Well, since it's been housing there, I haven't had a single complaint from the neighbors. And believe me, they all know how to reach me, because they did a lot in between every time there was trash or something else. So I think it is relationship work with neighbors that really helps. Sometimes that backfires, and we've all probably experienced NIMBY situations where I remember having inviting neighbors in for pizza to tell them that their neighbors are going to be just like them, and nothing scary going on here, same income bracket, whatever else. And man, they just they lit it up, and we had to fight a legal battle to get this thing in there. but other times much more success. But it seems the bottom line, not always the case, but for the most part, if the education seems to overcome fear. So when people better understand, they stop being so frightened and oppositional about things. And so it is sort of a balance. And I also just want to, while I've got just the floor here for a second, let's see here, where was it? Alicia, is it? No, Felicia had said criminal history is not a predictor of tenancy success. And I just want to say that really fits with what we're found, that our by name list of the longest stayers in Maine, again, we've had, hundreds and hundreds of people on this list, and we watch them every single week, whether they're housed or not, keep track of their successes. Out of all these people, a whole bunch of people have landed in the criminal justice system. They've been in jail, and they're in and out of jail pretty regularly. Everybody knows their by name, But I will say that only a couple people, maybe 3 out of 6, 7, or 800 people, have actually ended up in the prison system, which takes 6 months of sentencing. So people are getting picked up for petty offenses, generally for things having to do with being homeless, like not having a place to go to the bathroom, picked up for that, or if they, if most people have some sort of are frustrated about something and they raise their voice and they're in the privacy of their own home, nobody calls the police over that. But boy, if it happens outside, people will call the police, and the police don't know what to do, so they'll throw the person in jail. That kind of stuff happens a lot. And so people are in and out of there. But they stop. Again, the most important thing is that they stop doing this once they have housing. So that really fits with what you said, Felicia, that it is not a good predictor, because we can expect that people who are homeless and outside are going to be having encounters with law enforcement, and very likely are going to get some sort of record. And so are people actively in substance use disorder. And we should expect that and plan for it, but not box people out of housing, the very antidote to the issue in general. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. We had a question from Alexander about people graduating from permanent supportive housing, and Ben explained that it can be permanent. You don't have to leave if you don't want to. But then Alexander had a follow-up question about people moving along to other forms of housing. Do you want to speak to that?
I don't have any data. I mean, we've certainly got some anecdotal information. I think for an awful lot of people who live in permanent supportive housing, this is the model of housing this is the least restrictive setting in which they can thrive, right? They're going to need this kind of assistance on an ongoing basis. But there are exceptions to that. Great, lots of them. We've certainly seen. I think I would put it less than 10%, but we've seen people move on to homeownership, to reconciliation with and reuniting with families, and forming new households or reforming households, as well as people just moving into other affordable housing, right? Like, I'm sick of living in this tiny little unit. I want to have a 1-bedroom now, or a 2-bedroom, or I've got or they form a household, they meet somebody, now there's 2 of them, and living in a tiny little place isn't going to work anymore. So there are folks who move on, but it's a self-motivated process. One of the other, I guess, one encouragement for it is, the way an awful lot of permanent supportive housing is supported with project-based vouchers, project-based Section 8 vouchers. Sorry. And typically the way the project basing rules work is that once someone has stayed in an apartment that has a project-based voucher for a year or longer, they're eligible for kind of a sticky voucher, basically. They're eligible to, presuming that housing authority, subject to their policies, et cetera, and availability, but usually it works that you can basically find a new place to live that will accept a portable voucher, and that housing authority will give you a portable voucher, but we still, the permanent supportive housing project still keeps the contracted project-based voucher as well. So, and it's actually one reason that sometimes housing authorities kind of don't like project basing because, you know, it's like, well, every time we project base one, that's creating new like priority people who can get tenant vouchers as well. And it eats up some of our vouchers and doesn't allow us to get to people who've been patiently waiting on the wait list. But it's a great benefit for the households who are living in project-based voucher properties.
All right, I think we got all of the questions in the chat. Do a last call for anyone? No? All right. I think that wraps it. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you all very much for attending.
Bye.
Bye-bye.